coming in. And we are now being live streamed. So hi, everyone. I'm Paul Grand. I am the CEO here at MedTech Innovator. Welcome. If you've never been to one of our webinars before, let me tell you a little bit what this is all about. MedTech Innovator is an accelerator, but we are not an accelerator for people with ideas. We're an accelerator for people who are a little more downstream, for people who have products that they're developing. In many cases, they're already finished developing and they're clinical. And in some cases, they're already on the market. So we're going to be tackling topics in this discussion that are more advanced, that aren't 101 necessarily, although it might be a couple 101 in there. But most of it is going to be designed for people who are already thinking about the topic that we're discussing. And so our accelerator involves, as I said, companies at varying stages. They go all the way to commercial, and we want to make sure everyone's topics are addressed. Most of the questions we're going to be talking about today with our panel are ones that were posed by our cohort companies. And some were posed by the panelists themselves too. So we're going to have a great discussion. Today's topic is reimbursement, and it's designed to, as I said, to kind of get into some of the weeds for companies that are more tactically dealing with questions about payment. And for those of you out there who aren't in that space, let me just say, as someone who's an investor as well as running the world's largest accelerator for medical technology, that the number one thing that everybody should be thinking about is payment. And I know, of course, we're trying to save, people's lives and improve lives and all those things. Of course, when you're thinking about your product and how you're going to get it to market and all those things, a lot of times you say, God, payment, that's the last thing I need to think about. But I can promise you, as I know one of our panelists said in a prep call, reimbursement is something you talk about at the whiteboard. So we'll get into that as we go. But it is a critical topic for everyone. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists for today. We've got three great people who are going to be telling you, talking on this topic, but they're not all consultants. They're not all people who are just in jobs in reimbursement or related to reimbursement. They've got varying backgrounds that you're really going to find interesting. So I'll let them introduce themselves. I'm going to start off first with Chris Brooks. So Chris, who is the Director of Healthcare Economics at Impulse Dynamics. Chris, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do at Impulse Dynamics, your background? Love to hear that.
Of course. Yeah, so Paul, first I want to thank you because I think you said reimbursement professionals are the most important people in MedTech. So first up, I'm glad we agree on that topic. Secondly, Chris Brooks, I've been in the MedTech industry for a little over 20 years. Well, it certainly doesn't seem that long. The last half of that, thereabouts, has been involved with coding, coverage, and payment topics. As Paul said, I run reimbursement for Impulse Dynamics, which is a small early-stage company. We're dedicated to the transformation of heart failure treatment. We've got two devices that are on the market, both in Europe and in the United States. We're actively enrolling in an IDE trial, and we have some future innovations, which we expect to, do IDE trials, next year or thereabouts. So, kind of been there at the whiteboard, taking the product to commercialization, and have the chance to kind of start that process all over. I love working with new upstart technology, and I'm excited for today's panel.
Fantastic. Great background. You were the one who made that comment about the whiteboard and thinking about reimbursement literally at that stage when you're just coming up with ideas. So I'll give you that credit, Chris. All right, let's move on then to our next speaker for today, Tiffany Gilbreth. Tiffany.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Gilbreth. I am the VP of Clinical and Medical Affairs for Apollo Endosurgery, which is a smaller company, but I've been there for about 11 years. I also do some consulting for these types of startup companies because I really enjoy it. I probably have a very diverse background. I am not in reimbursement. I started out as a sales rep. I moved into and was a surgical assistant for a general surgeon. Then I went back into sales and then have done everything in the MedTech company marketing, product development, strategic mergers and acquisitions, kind of you name it, and I have done it. And after an acquisition, I needed to stand up a clinical and medical affairs department from the ground up. Apollo had never had one. So because of my kind of clinical and commercial background, they asked me to do that. So I started a medical affairs group from the ground up. And then they said about 4 years ago, well, so since you've done that, now here's reimbursement, figure it out. And so I spent 4 years. I had some really good teachers along the way. Many of you may know Leslie Wise. She started the company Evidence Matters. She, I would say, is my mentor. And I have learned, she's probably forgotten more than I actually know, but I definitely have been able to use the experience. And I think that I can bring some unique ways to look at things in these companies. So I really am enjoying working with MedTech innovators, and I'm excited about this opportunity because I'll learn as well.
Well, thank you. Leslie is definitely a guru in the space, and I have learned a ton from her. But like you said, boy, she knows more than I think many people will ever know about this industry. So she's fantastic. All right, let's move on then to Adi Renbaum, president of A&R Consulting. Adi.
Hi, hi everyone. Thank you, Paul. I want to thank you and MedTech Innovator for the opportunity to join this esteemed group today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm Adi Renbaum. I am the president of A&R Consulting, which is a boutique reimbursement consulting firm where we advise C-suite executives about strategies that leverage reimbursement to really think about how to drive revenue growth in companies. I focus today primarily on medical device, medical technologies, including digital technologies. And but my experience has run the gamut from a variety of office-based procedures to devices that have been used in hospitals, ambulatory settings, and a variety of different technologies. I haven't always been a consultant. I've worked myself in a couple of startups, and I understand the process and the joys and the pains. I've been responsible for securing national reimbursement on a variety of technologies, and that includes both pursuing Medicare policies as well as commercial insurance policies, negotiating contracts with insurers, and really trying to create a platform where the sales organization can help drive pull-through of procedure volume, and then revenue to the company begins to accrue and grow. Today, I've been in this space for about 25 years, so I started when I was a child, and currently I sit on the Medicare National Evidence Advisory Committee for the Medicare National Coverage Group, and I also am co-director of what's called the Executive Leadership Council at an Association of Managed Care Physicians, which is a group of physicians with managed care plans who are looking to understand and participate in the development of coverage for innovative technologies. So I really span the breadth across the payer universe in the U.S. and all the facets associated with it, including coding and payment, et cetera. So I'm delighted to be here.
Very good. Great to have all three of you here. So what I want to do is start off with just kind of a basic question here, which is, are payers out there looking to welcome innovators with open arms, and are they out there going, hey, we're looking for a clinical benefit, or we're looking for economic benefit, some mix of both? How do these payers prioritize bringing in new innovation and in terms of clinical and economic benefit? And I'm going to start with Chris on this because I remember, again, some of the pre-discussion. So Chris, tell us a little about your thoughts here.
Yeah, so a lot of the answers I'm going to give today are it depends, right? But what I would say is that payers are definitely responsive to the industry, but they're much more so responsible to demand from both physicians that are in their network as well as patients that are their beneficiaries. While I'm certainly not going to say it's impossible for your strategy to go to payers first, To me, the kind of sequence of events is generate clinical demand, start to show real world outcomes. And I think we're going to talk about, randomized controlled trials versus real world evidence a little bit later in the presentation. But I think, my experience is you start with developing the clinical demand, fighting for authorizations on a case-by-case basis, and building that real-world evidence so that you can go back to a payer and say, look, we've done the right things in this kind of incubator-type environment for a randomized controlled trial. We've now got real-world data where we show that we can replicate those results. And oh, by the way, you've got some experience and some knowledge with this product in that you've authorized some beneficiaries. So, to me, as challenging as the prior authorization process can be and as frustrating as it can be, every chance you have to obtain a prior authorization, I look at it as a chance to educate a payer so that when you do get that meeting with leadership, you don't want to be going into that 30-minute meeting with them having no idea what you offer, who you treat, what you do. If they've got some claims and some familiarity, when you do get that meeting with leadership, it's going to go much, much more smoothly and be much, much more substantive. So my thought is develop the clinical need first, one-off cases where you're fighting for authorization on behalf of every single patient rather than seeking policy, developing that breadth of real-world evidence, and then going to a payer once you've established that, so that, again, that meeting is sort of a midpoint in your relationship, not the starting point in your relationship, if you will.
That's a really good, it's a number of really good points in there that I want to unpack. One of them that you just mentioned about timing. And so just very quickly on that, I know some of our companies that have participated in FDA's payer communication task force program where they're able to get in there during their pre-sub and actually involve payers. Is that the right time to approach payers, when you're, seeking regulatory approval or planning your regulatory? Is it earlier? As you said, it's the midpoint maybe in the conversation. So, when do you guys suggest, actually talking to payers? Addie, I'll start with you. D, sorry.
It's okay. Well, I definitely echo Chris's comments about driving some demand. And I would say the answer is it's probably never too early to talk to payers. We just need to understand what message you're delivering at each point in time. So at those FDA pre-sub meetings, perhaps you're talking to them about what the clinical protocol will look like, what evidence you'll be developing, and not yet asking for a coverage decision, but rather trying to learn from them what's most important to those payers about your product, your technology, and what they'll be looking for and comparing to when they do consider it for coverage, versus going to the payers, as Chris mentioned, when you've got evidence, you've got data, you're driving utilization. We always call it sort of a bottom-up, top-down approach where you want to build that demand and then drive those meetings at the highest levels to try to get the coverage policies established. That's when you're really going in there with your full package. But I just want to add one comment, which is that, we have to remember that the payers are our customers, really, because they are the ones who are going to, pay the docs and the hospitals who ultimately buy our products. So we have to remember to go in there thinking about what are their needs. And a lot of times, I'll have clients who say, I'm ready to go to the payer. Here's my pitch. Here's my message. Here's my product. And we need to understand what are the payers worried about. Is your product going to answer a problem, solve a problem that they have in a treatment pathway, perhaps that's unmanageable right now, or perhaps they are worried about repeat procedures and you've got a solution that can help mitigate that. You really need to be thinking about, how does my product help solve that problem, and how do I contextualize it for the payer so that they're motivated to take action about my technology compared to the thousands they're asked to look at, because it addresses a need that they have. So I want to reiterate the importance of this isn't just kind of asking payers to cover something because there's demand. You really need to also understand what need of theirs can you solve with your solution.
Very, very well said. When I think about, approaching payers or talking to payers as well, it's also kind of a black box. It's like, how do you do that? How do you reach out? Can you just literally go to their websites and find some contact information? Is there what's the guidance? Now I know there's consultants and others who are experts in the space, and they can help guide you along the way. You got to find them in the first place. Of course, Adi, you're a consultant in the space. I know Tiffany, you are as well, in addition to your day job. So maybe just quickly, just let me ask, briefly, I'm going to go to Tiffany for a second here, which is, Tiffany, how do you're, as you said, this wasn't your entire background, right? You've done all sorts of things. How do you find the experts who are going to guide you through this process? And are they the ones who help you talk to payers initially, or how do we do that?
So I think, and that was a part of our call yesterday, I think that's a really important point. And someone like Adi, who's got this, this consulting business, who's done this, who's come from this background, is the kind of person that you want to engage sooner rather than later. There is sort of a problem, or at least I'll talk from our personal experience, that not all of the consultants are created equal. I like to use the term, and I use this with all due respect, fog sculptors. A lot of people come in, they sculpt the fog, they tell you how they can do all these things, but then they never actually deliver. So if you are in a stage in your company where you're looking for people who can actually help you go to that next level, like my area of expertise is really generating clinical evidence. I did not have a clinical budget at Apollo. We were a startup company. There were only 40 of us. I generated probably close to 400 publications with this much of a clinical budget prior to actually ever embarking on a full-blown, expensive randomized controlled trial. Along the way, we had worked with different consultants, none of which gave us much information. It's now that I know enough to be dangerous now. So if we were going to go out and look for those people now, you need to get people that have a track record. You need to have them make sure they give you examples of how they would, in your particular business, execute on things. And you need to ask for evidence of execution. So when Adi was just going over her background, she has executed on payment coverage and strategies. And unfortunately, they're not all like that. So as these companies are entering this stage, or even before they enter this stage, find someone, look them up, do your homework, ask for references, and then do a really good background check before you embark upon them, and then let them tell you, do I need to call a payer? I would never call a payer. I would never know how to do that in the way that wouldn't get me in trouble down the road, probably. But someone like Adi and someone like Chris that has that experience, they know who to ask for, what to ask, and what not to ask. So I think that's something that is probably, if I could do things over again in my trajectory with my current with Apollo, we would have done more homework. And again, now I know enough to ask some good questions.
Well, that's great that you gave us some of those questions. So thank you for that. And we could dig more into that even later, Tiffany. But that is critical, right? You got to have, I always say, you want to have the best people around the table, whether you're co-founders, the consultants and other people you're working with, your board members, they should be the best. It shouldn't matter where they're based. Don't just find the people who are down the street and convenient. Find the best. We have, I don't even know what we're up to now, 30 or 40 value coaches who work with us during our value program here, and they're very carefully selected for their expertise because we want people to work with the best. That's something we need to publish on our website, by the way. I'm just thinking about that. We should publish the list of who our experts are. We have a master page with like everybody, but I think it'd be easier if we did that as a subset because it's such an important area. But let me get back then to the discussion here. Before we get into some of the more tactical, detailed things regarding reimbursement, coding, coverage, payment, all these things. I actually want to cover something that I know a lot of my companies and other companies that are out there are thinking about and are doing in practice, and that's some out-of-pocket, some cash pay before they're getting paid through a regulated or reimbursed structure. And that's something that I know, Tiffany, you have some experience with. So I'm going to stick with you here and just ask you a little bit about that. What has been your experience on the cash pay side? How do you do that? How do you build up that demand? As I said, I got a bunch of companies who are interested in that and who are trying that themselves. So any light you can shed on, your process for how you're doing that, and then ultimately how that dovetails into a reimbursed model where things maybe scale up.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, we have been doing some cash pay things, or our physicians have been doing cash pay processes for some of our procedures. And the way that they are doing it is really more, they're driving it, of course, because, we don't give coding or coverage advice. But they create letters of medical necessity and the reasons why this particular, and it's sort of going back to what Adi said, going back to why is this good for not only the patient, but also why is this a benefit to the payer? And so those that is all outlined in that information. And so they do that on the one-off hand-to-hand. But for cash pay, patients, I work in the bariatric space. A lot of patients are not ready to have surgery. There's something like 140 million people in the US alone that qualify or are considered obese and qualify for surgery, and only 1% of them actually go through with it. And so physicians have gotten very good at setting up, working with their ambulatory surgery centers or their outpatient surgery areas, and they've created a cash pay model, and then the physicians market it, and really it has worked quite well for these physicians, and patients are doing it. There's then hopefully as we're moving like what we're doing the hand-to-hand combat, people are doing the cash pay. So we're creating that information, all the while collecting data along the way, that when we are ready to go for the coding and coverage, that we will have that information to have those conversations. But it really is about making sure that what you bring to the table is a safe, good, better solution. And people are willing to pay for that, for sure. I mean, the aesthetics business has taught us that there are opportunities for cash pay.
Yeah, and Chris, just if I think Adi has Adi, I'll go to you first. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments on what Tiffany's points are, which that if you had asked me 5 years ago about self-pay or cash pay business, I would have been a little more reluctant to say, yes, it's a great way to start. But things have changed significantly over the last 5 years. It used to be that you target really more of the lifestyle type of therapies for people who had means to pay for those kinds of procedures out of pocket before insurance was coverage was available to them. But the insurance market has changed dramatically over the past 5 years, in that so many people have high deductible health plans, and I think I read recently that I want to get the statistic right, that 40% or more of people with high deductible health plans have a deductible of $10,000 per year. And that's a tremendous amount of money to spend out of pocket. And so if you're going to use those dollars for non-emergency situations, or, for your outside of well care visits and such, as the patient, you would do a lot of homework, as you would with anything you would spend, that kind of money on. And I think that is really driving a lot of patients to ask questions, be their own advocates, ask physicians for therapies that might not be yet covered, and it's giving the physicians an opportunity to get experience and to be paid fairly for what they, or at least be paid what they want to charge for what they're providing, rather than what insurance would typically pay them. And it does create you start to build a beachhead of users and adopters, people who are comfortable using your procedure or performing your procedure comfortable with purchasing it, having it in stock, and so on, and all of those facets that start to drive, early revenue growth. And so it's really different today than it was, like I said, even 5 years ago. And while it's not right for every product. Certainly, inpatient treatments might not be the first thing I would think about for self-pay, but it does have a place in a lot of different therapies. The key is to know when it's time to take the message to the payers, and to do it before that cash pay business is so strong that the payers turn to you and say, why do I cover it? Why do I need to cover it? Look, patients are willing to pay for it out of pocket. So you've got to mind that sort of leap between it's going really well in the self-pay and getting into commercial coverage, so that you don't miss the opportunity.
Very interesting point, Adi, about maybe the risks with too good a self-pay model. Chris, I know I was going to ask you before, you're in cardiovascular. That's a massive space, massive need. Bariatrics, obviously, and GI as well too, Tiffany. But in the GI space and in bariatrics, maybe there's some procedures that can be done for less money, let's say, right? Then cardiovascular, these can be really expensive. Is there a self-pay model there at all, or is it and I think you have some history with this again. So any comments on this before we move on to?
It's a great concept. And Adi said a lot of things. I was going to chime in and say you really have to know your market, your therapy area. Cardiovascular, the opportunity for self-pay or cash pay is probably dramatically less than some other therapy areas. So it's not really something many companies actively pursue. That's not to say the landscape won't change. And I agree with Adi, as procedures shift to different types of service, i.e. a surgery center, as the predominance of high deductible plans grows. One thing I love about reimbursement is they say, the only thing that stays the same is change. So to Adi's point, the way things looked 5 years ago, the way things look today, and the way they're going to look 5 years from now are all very different. So I think, while that may not be for things like cardiology or oncology, for example, or inpatient services, someplace you really need to think now, you've got to always anticipate that the sands are going to shift, and certainly keep your eye on that potential, because, what's the reality today, what's going to be 5 years from now are almost indefinitely different.
Yep. Yeah. Boy, I love that comment. The only thing that stays the same is change. Let's talk about change a little bit. So, boy, there is so much change and so much unpredictability. What is predictable? What do we see coming up in the future? I'm going to start with the D on this. There's all the prior authorization legislation. There's so much going on. What do we need to know about, right? We're not people who are going, okay, I'm just thinking about maybe creating a company. We're out there. We're in the weeds. We're like just trying to get approved by some regulatory body. We're just trying to make sure our device, is safe and effective. But what do we need to be thinking about that's coming down the pipe? That what are things that are, again, that we need to have on our radar that we probably don't, or we may not. Adi, I'll start with you on that.
Sure. So that's a big question, and I'll start just by saying that reimbursement can be the existential question, really. It can make or break a business. You could have the most tremendous FDA strategy in place with a clinical trial plan that is superb, and find yourself in a situation on the payment side with Medicare, for example, where what you're offering simply would be payable and subsumed by an existing payment. So yes, we think it's incredibly valuable to the patients. Yes, we think it's a medically necessary procedure. Thank you for bringing it to the market. There will be no incremental payment for your device. That's not an uncommon problem. So being able to anticipate some of those payment changes, I think, are essential. And so there is some consistency in what comes down the pike, and Medicare puts out proposed rules every year for all of its settings of care that are relevant to us, the physician office, the hospital outpatient setting, and the ambulatory surgery setting, as well as the hospital inpatient setting and some other settings of care. Without getting into the weeds too much, those are essential to follow and track. I would even say a few years before your product comes to market, so that you can start reading about what Medicare is proposing or how they're contemplating paying for new things in the treatment area or domain or therapeutic area that you're working in, and start laying down the foundations for how you're going to fit into those payment systems as the time moves on. And oftentimes you might need to go and advocate for a change that Medicare is already planning to put in place, and there's a period of time where you can do that in advance of your product coming to market and so on. So I think just understanding that there's this flow of information on an annual basis that Medicare puts out in proposed rules that are open for comment to the public, anyone in the public, and that those get implemented on a yearly basis, and commercial payers tend to follow those rules by and large for what they need to do. So I think that's really an important thing to watch out for. And then you mentioned prior authorization. The whole area of Medicare Advantage, the idea that Medicare patients can choose to stay in the traditional fee-for-service Medicare as we sort of all understand it, which is just go to a doc, the doc submits a claim, a hospital submits a claim, that has changed dramatically, and we're seeing, close to 50% of Medicare enrollees going to Medicare Advantage, which is the commercial plans, getting money from Medicare, getting a capitated rate from Medicare on a per beneficiary basis to take care of those patients. But what they're doing is applying all of their traditional management and control tools on those patients' access to care. And prior authorization has been the primary one. So whereas if you have regular Medicare, you can go and have a procedure done, and no one will ask you first, is there medical necessity for it? You have to clear it with anyone. No. Your doc will order it, you do it, what have you. If you're another patient for that same procedure, but you have a Medicare Advantage plan, you have to go through a prior authorization process, and that may at minimum delay scheduling and conducting the procedure or what have you, and oftentimes just stops it from moving forward altogether. In fact, those processes have become fairly egregious, and so the OIG recently investigated and ran a report to show that Medicare Advantage plans have more onerous requirements for prior authorization than Medicare rules require. They ask for information that regular Medicare doesn't. And so legislation is now forthcoming and has passed the House, and it needs to pass the Senate. Implementation will be 3 years from the period of time, at least as the bill reads now, from the time it would go into effect, but it would require very explicit and electronic, meaning faster prior authorization to try to move that process along. That's an important area to follow, I think, but I would follow anything to do with sort of the evolutions of policies on the Medicare Advantage side. It's really, we need so much education to help patients understand what they're signing up for when they sign up for that program, as well as physicians to be able to plan how they're going to manage their budgets and their cash flows when they're dealing with Medicare Advantage as a bigger part of their payer mix than in the past. So that's a big area I would pay attention to.
Yeah, no, that's a really good one. Thanks for that background. Definitely asked the right question to the right panelist, although I know Chris and Tiffany can speak on this as well. I also am a little bit curious, knowing that, things are changing again, and, nothing is done yet, but there's also, it started with MSIT, now it's TSIT. Again, this whole breakthrough pathway was amazing, and it still is amazing, and there's all sorts of benefits. I advocate people apply for breakthrough designation. But one of the big benefits originally was MSIT, which then was repealed. So now we have TSIT. Can someone just very quickly sum up what does that mean for our innovators out there, and for TSIT, and and is it better than MSIT? Is it how is it different? But just quickly, like, what is it? Without even dwelling on MSIT, let's forget that. Let's just talk about TSITs if that's what's on the table. So who would like to take that?
I'm happy to take that one. I mean, our product received breakthrough designation. I would absolutely advocate innovators who qualify for either breakthrough or STEP to apply. But I also think part of that application process is realizing what does it get you and what does it not. Tiff and I had talked about this a little bit yesterday. I maybe mistakenly liken breakthrough to fast pass. It doesn't truncate the regulatory process. It gets you to the top, the front of the line. It gets you some advantages when you're looking at incremental payment things like NTAP and PassThrough, which are programs, I'm sure that will apply to several of the folks on this call. But it comes from FDA, which is a regulatory agency, not CMS. It doesn't have anything to do with coverage, at least not at this point in time. So it's really important to understand what does breakthrough get you, but what doesn't. I will absolutely be an advocate for TSET when the rule is released. We're hearing maybe early next year. But again, you kind of have to play play the rules now. And right now, there is no TSET. MSIT was first introduced in August of 2020. Everyone on this call likely knows it went through multiple machinations, ultimately repealed. We'll see what TSET looks like. We've certainly heard murmurings of what it might look like and when it'll come out. But until it does, the playing field is the playing field. You qualify for breakthrough, absolutely advocate applying, but also understand that while it confers certain advantages to your product, there are limitations, and it's really important not just to know the upsides, but to also know those limitations as well.
Thank you. And you mentioned one other thing, again, so let's get the acronyms out of the way, NTAP. Let me just cover that one real quick, if there's such thing as covering that real quick. But Chris, just, why don't we just continue on that with you, and then we'll move on to some other topics. NTAP, what's that?
Yeah, so there's NTAP, which is new technology add-on payment. I also think we should mention transitional pass-through payment, which is kind of the outpatient analog to inpatient NTAP. But basically, they're two incremental payment tools that the Division of Acute Care and the Division of Outpatient Care make available to innovators. One of the great things there are a lot of great things about CMS, by the way. One of the best things is that it's public, so you can go out and find all the information needed about these programs on their website. But if you qualify for either or both of those programs, I absolutely advocate applying. And I absolutely advocate using a consultant to apply. I would feel very comfortable putting together an application for either program, but I also, given the stakes of such an application, it's really important to get it right. The other thing is CMS, they like engagement with innovators. So if you're thinking of applying for NTAP or PassThrough, speak to the relevant, division or department within CMS. And the other thing, though, that I always tell people is really important, they're 2 to 3 year programs. So they're really, really important to consider what does this mean for us for those 2 to 3 years. But one of the pitfalls that I've certainly seen companies fall into is not having a really good strategy for what happens when those programs end. So, absolutely apply, understand if your product's available, in the inpatient or outpatient setting or both. Neither one is contingent upon the other. But also realize that while they do bring a ton of value to innovators in terms of new products, they also are temporary programs. And just like you need to plan for the beginning, you need to plan for when they end as well.
Great advice. Not long-term programs, and as you said, understand that you've got to have a plan for after these programs end. So very well said. Let's talk about, I'm going to shift topics here because we only have 20 more minutes in the live YouTube portion of this and LinkedIn live portion of this, which is crazy. I can't believe we've already talked for 40 minutes. But again, this is a conversation that could go on for hours and hours, and we still wouldn't scratch the surface. For those of you who are on YouTube and LinkedIn live, if you have questions, you can put them into the chat boxes. My team will relay them to me, and I'll try and get them answered in these next 20 minutes. If not, you can always still ask questions, and we'll pass them along to our panelists. And for those of you who are here from our cohorts, of course, you can just put your questions into the Q&A box, and we will answer them during our 30-minute post session when you get to ask your questions. So please do queue those up or ask any things along the way in the chat. So let's talk about planning ahead and not doing things in a linear fashion, which is what a lot of people tend to do. They go, oh, I'm going to design my product and develop it, and then I'll get it reimbursed. Approved by a regulatory body, and then I'll think about payment later on, which is a recipe for failure. I can promise you. So, what is one of the things that everybody, is now, as I mentioned earlier, people are starting to push up the reimbursement kind of in the payment thinking earlier, I really hope, in their process. And if you're not, you should, and very early in your process. And one of the things that I know people, wonder about is, real world evidence and data. And data ultimately is what everybody wants, in addition, obviously, to improving outcomes and all the things that keep people healthy. In order to do that, we need data. And so now people are going, okay, when can I collect data? How do I collect data? What can I use it for besides, just my own intelligence? What can help drive payment and coverage and all these important things? So I guess what the question I'm going to ask now of our panel, a little discussion here, is about what you can do as a small company. You're not Medtronic, you're not J&J, you're not a huge company with all these tons of people. You're a small innovator, shop with 5 people or 7 people or whatever you are. And you're going to be fighting it out to, collect data. I know one of our companies asked that question in advance about, can you be doing your RWE during your RCT? Like, people want to know, like, what can they do and when? Tiffany, I know you've got, a bunch of experience doing a lot with a little in some cases. So maybe tell us, kind of what's some of the, the tactical things people can be doing to collect the evidence that's going to help justify payment later on, and when do you start that? So Tiffany.
So I guess it kind of depends on whether you've got a 510K or a de novo type product versus a PMA, because it's a little harder to do real world evidence with a PMA product just because of the nature of that. So we did this in a 510K world, and the minute it got a 510K approved, I began to target procedures and physicians who were early adopters, willing to work with us and willing to work with us for free, which is really what it is. And if you have a really exciting technology or an exciting enabling technology that does some cool things for procedures, it's not hard to find people that just want to be part of that. And so again, I have a commercial and sales background, so I went to all of them, and this just got them fired up, and they might use the product for 2 or 3 procedures. Great, write it up, publish it. Great, write it up, publish it. And then as it began to grow, then it's great, write it up, submit it to a meeting, and we might just get posters. Okay, so great. So then you get posters for the first year, and then all of this begins this sort of snowball effect, and ultimately you go from having 2 or 3 presentations or posters at a meeting to 150, which was what happened to us. We started out with 2 or 3, and last year we had 125 and at one meeting. And so it's just a growth thing. And then I'm a huge fan of registries. We set up real world registries. They're super easy to do. You can either work with a hospital system that has a REDCap database, or you internally, there's a system called Medrio that you can easily program it. You can easily set these up. And then going back to what Chris and Adi said, where I did not have the information or the expertise when I first started about what payors or information about reimbursement, now when I design registries, all of those things that are important that I've learned are important to payors, they're part of it. And again, those are not hard to set up. You usually can do them for relatively inexpensive ways. Start with 2 or 3 places, then you can go to more. And so we use real world registries a lot. In fact, our real world registries outside the US has been the basis of our shift from MDD to MDR in Europe. And we've pulled, we have a couple thousand cases that are logged in there, and we pulled information from that, and we're able to give that back to our notified body and check the box with, our different regulators. But first of all, it starts slow, and you have to have somebody or people that are willing to just do a lot of hard work. And then once you kind of get that, it really is a snowball. And, you can do it relatively cheaply. And I know the Holy Grail is a blinded randomized controlled trial, but I don't want to take the answer to that kind of a test until I know the answer. And real world evidence can help point you in the right direction to make sure before your company goes and spends $3, $4, $5, $6, $8, $10 million on what a trial costs, to do the things to get for real coverage, coding, and payment, that you are getting the answers along the way for a fraction of that. And so that's kind of how I've always run my business, because we didn't have the resources. Now I do things a little bit differently because I just know a little bit more now. But that's how I think real world evidence is awesome and definitely worth the effort.
I agree. Very well said. And I saw Adi and Chris nodding their heads through a lot of what you were saying. So I know there's agreement on that topic. I want to ask Adi a little bit about something that I know a lot of people ask, and so I think it's appropriate to ask you this particular question, Adi, which is, I've got an early stage company. And I'm budgeting for all sorts of things. And when I say early stage, let's say the company's, it's got its prototypes, maybe even clinical prototypes done, and maybe it's getting ready for first in human, whatever, or maybe they've done early first in human, but they're early on still. They're not like, oh, we're commercializing next week. So they're still relatively early, but they and it could be even earlier, and they're maybe it is the whiteboard stage, but they've got to spend some money and some energy on thinking about reimbursement, and they're probably not going to have somebody of your caliber, any of your caliber in-house who's able to focus on this, because frankly, most people, they're just going to hire engineers and people at the early days, right? And so someone's going to be wearing multiple hats if they have that responsibility. So my question is, a company raises $4 million, let's say, or $6 million, whatever their number is for their Series A or whatever, and now they've got some funding. What kind of budgets should they set aside for somebody, as Tiffany put it, who actually knows what they're doing and isn't just sculpting the fog? What kind of budget should you put aside for reimbursement consulting?
Excellent question. That really is an excellent question. And actually, it dovetails to what I was going to comment on related to how to think about your trial strategy and real world evidence. And that is that you don't need a reimbursement expert in your company day one, and you certainly don't need to employ anyone with reimbursement expertise until you are, literally at the, thinking about your commercialization strategy. That may be a year prior to FDA approval or so forth. Where consultants are most valuable is when you need a short bolus of intensely expert information and insight. And so these are short-term, weeks or months sort of engagements where you're sitting with the leadership of the clinical group and hopefully the regulatory and the engineers to think through, again, a couple of years down the road, who will be using this product, what literally physician specialties, what setting of care, who are the patients, what are some of the fundamental demographic and socioeconomic and clinical factors associated with this patient population, so that you can anticipate who your payors are going to be and what questions they're going to ask, and work your way backwards to designing a clinical program. So while I can't give you dollars and cents because it varies dramatically, I would say that these early engagements, again, you want to work with someone who has sat at the table with the regulatory and clinical teams and has helped them work through what are the key endpoints here. Do we need a 1-year study? Do we need a follow-up for 3 years, 5 years? All of those different variables. How do we build in some quality of life measures? Do you do those things as part of real world evidence development? How do you contemplate economic impact of your service and what you're going to be doing and what your technology might render? All of those things are, as I said, short-term, sort of intense strategic conversations with someone at the table, a partner who has done this 5, 6, 10 times, with other companies and through other scenarios. So that's really, I think, what's most important, even as you're going through the clinical stage. Again, thinking about reimbursement is important and needs to be done early enough once you have a frozen product model and you know what it's going to be when it ends up on the market, so that you can start thinking about where do I need coverage, how much is, code, what are the codes issues, and what are the payment issues. But until you have that, it's really theoretical, and it's about putting those building blocks in place to be ready for that. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Can I add something, Paul?
Yeah, please, Chris.
I mean, so, when you talk to investors, and I throw this out to the panel, I mean, I think the investment community is becoming increasingly more facile in how reimbursement works. I agree with everything that Dee said, but one thing I would advocate in terms of early engagement, if you want to attract investment, you've got to be able to tell your commercial story. And if you can't really answer questions about what your reimbursement landscape will look like, I think it's really, really hard to attract, maybe not that Series A round where you go to your friends, but when you start going out to other investors, they're going to ask you questions about what is the reimbursement landscape, and that's going to define the size of your market. So to me, if you really want to be able to articulate the value of your company to an investor, maybe not that first round, but pretty soon thereafter, you're going to be facing questions about, what does it look like? So, again, it may not be a full-time employee, but I think, to Dee's point, an early on engagement with an investment or a reimbursement consultant to understand coding, coverage, and payment is really, really important. And it's hard to imagine doing that too early.
Agreed. And thanks for chiming in on that, Chris. So again, 8 minutes left in the main public part of the conversation here. So I want to cover a couple of things from this insanely long list of topics that we had at the beginning. And as I said, I could go on for hours. So let's just cover a couple of things. I know we did talk about. I think it was you, Dee, who was saying, we should be monitoring, we can be monitoring, things that, that Medicare and others are putting out information, maybe it was Chris, other people I think commented on this, that, that there's information is public and these are things we can be monitoring. Is that stuff that, our outside consultants should be doing for us and then keeping us informed? Should we be doing that as innovators? And again, if we should be doing it ourselves, like how do we do that? And again, like Dee, I'll go quickly to you on this.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that you want to, outsource and have a process for. Again, a very focused, specific, the areas of research should be very focused and specific and relevant to your business. It doesn't need to be an all-encompassing analysis. I would also say that an important source that you can start incorporating into the company sort of talk track and story is to take a look at, again, where are your customers communicating with one another? And a great source that I find is HFMA, Healthcare and Financial Management Association, MGMA, the Medical Group Management Association. Some of these groups where they are dealing with the financial issues, they're talking about revenue cycle management, their issues with reimbursement, and being looped into those and understanding, having some contacts in those organizations can help you understand what kind of issues your customers are going to have when your product gets to the market. So again, whether that's something you do internally as you get closer to commercialization, you don't really need that really early on. You really need to focus on the clinical program. But as you're starting to think about commercialization, understanding what your customers' pain points are and where they communicate and look for help, that's where you want to be tied into. So you can have advisors who guide you in that area, who can provide you, monthly updates. All of those things are available, and you don't need to spend more than what you really minimally should to get that information.
Okay, great. And Chris, quick question for you. You talked about this concept before of, even back at the whiteboard, you should be thinking about payment. What are the key questions? You're sitting there at the whiteboard or at some later stage with your engineers and people. what are the key questions that you ask and that you should be thinking about as it relates to payment and all the things that go into that?
Yeah, so I mean, reimbursement isn't this monolithic thing. And people who have worked with me are sick of me hearing coding, coverage, and payment. Those are the three fundamental areas. So I mean, I think to these points, a really early survey of, hey, I've got a product. Is there a PCS code or a CPT code that describes this? If not, how do I get one? Are there, payment categories into which I'm likely to fall? It's that quick sort of survey of, okay, is there a code that describes my procedure? Where does that code currently map from a payment? And do I think that is compatible with my therapy? And then what coverage policies are out there, or what other like products are being used to treat this disease state? That kind of ground level survey helps you chart your path. But it's really important that you break it down into those three components, because they are truly independent but related work streams. And I think where companies start to get into problems is they think of reimbursement as this monolithic thing, and it's really not. So to me, the more you can sort of break down, where do I stand in terms of codes? Where do I stand in terms of potential coverage? Where do I stand in terms of potential payment? And what are the things I can do to improve each of those three positions, the better off you're going to be in the long term.
Okay. So, we covered so much already. I know there's a lot we didn't cover. I'm going to take the last, several minutes here and go panelist by panelist. And, any things that you think we didn't cover that people need to hear and make sure they're aware of. Let's start with that. So, Tiffany, I'm going to start with you. What are some things that you've been thinking about in this conversation? Like, oh, and I want to make that point. What might be a point or two that you think we should be making?
I just want to echo that if I had known then what I know now, I would have done some things a little differently. I'm not saying it would have changed where we are, but I would have optimized some of the efforts that I undertook. And so I think to Adi's and Chris's point, engage these people. And I love the questions that Chris just kind of laid out. If I had known those then when we were planning this, I wouldn't have, because, and maybe this is for like all the different, making sure that you have a certain percentage, so you get a device intensive and all of those very challenging things. If you're creating, the next TAVR and you're not doing it to get covered under that same sort of code, and it's going to cost you way more to make it, then you're not really doing your company a good service. So I can only say that you should do these things early and understand them early. And if I had known those things earlier, it definitely has changed how I've run my business for the last 5 years. But the first 6, not saying we would have been in it any differently or better or worse. It's just I would have been more efficient in what I did. So I think that Adi's point about getting somebody, asking those questions that Chris just asked, that would save you lots of time and money, quite frankly.
Down the road. Yeah, I agree with that too. And thank you for that. And, and Tiffany, I hear from everybody. They're always like, God, I wish I'd known that 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 5 years ago. That's a very common thing that, I hear everybody say in every discipline. So we're all learning, and then these sands are shifting all the time. So, but that's great advice. Thank you. And again, we're going to get into private Q&A. We can deal with some more of these questions a little bit, but thanks for that, Tiffany. Let me go to you next, Christopher. So again, any points you think you'd like to make, things that you want to make sure innovators are thinking about in these last couple minutes?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to feel kind of like, kittens, unicorns, and apple pies, but start with the patient. Adi mentioned earlier that there are lots of stakeholders in the healthcare value chain, but the one sort of common thread is everybody cares about patients. So, that should be at the center of everything we do. If I can tip my hat to Impulse Dynamics, I think our level of focus on what patients need is paramount to everything we do. And that, even though it doesn't feel like that's part of a reimbursement strategy, it absolutely is. So again, multiple stakeholders in this value chain, all with different objectives, but the one common thread is everybody wants to take care of patients. So you've got to always keep that top of mind.
Great. Patient at the center, for sure. Thank you on that, Chris. Adi.
Well, I echo what Chris said. Absolutely, the patients come first. That's why we're all doing this, and it kind of dovetails into my comment, which is really about decide what kind of company or what kind of product you're going to develop in subsequent products. Is it a 510K or is it a de novo or PMA product? And it's going to have huge implications for the trajectory of the company, speed to market, and then just growth once you're on the market. You can get to market very quickly or faster with a 510K. But the barriers to access from a payment perspective, a coverage perspective, are much higher today than they've ever been for 510K technologies. Spending the time and the investment on a PMA trial, where I know it's, the costs are not just, they're significantly higher, is likely to pay off in terms of market adoption and rate to market adoption. Payers are just much more focused today than ever on the rigor of the clinical data. They are interested in real world data, as Tiffany described, and particularly the kind of things Tiffany described. But the hurdles continue to rise for evidence proving out that this new thing is really better than everything else that we've already done and tried. So I really encourage people to think very carefully about which regulatory path they want to take and what implications that'll have on their market potential.
Yeah, great point. And it made me think of something. I'm going to go one more question over here on time. And it's something that I've heard people say in the past, which is that, and again, I'm not saying this is true, but I'm asking you guys, 510K, the inherent message of a 510K is, hey, you're just like everything else on the market in this category and the predicates, and therefore, it's easier path right to market. Do payers look at 510Ks and say, hey, you're offering no more benefit than anything else out there. You're a 510K, so I'm not going to pay you anymore. Is that true or false? Anyone?
It depends on how, if put it this way, if you have a device or product, a solution that can be paid under existing payment systems, use those payment systems and understand that that's the payment that you're going to get, that your providers will get. If that's good enough, great. You don't need me, you don't need expensive consultants, you don't need anybody to tell you, just, go with that. And that's a way to build that market. If it's as good as or better than your competitors, you're all getting paid the same, you fight it out on the clinical benefits with the docs. So it really depends on codes and payment, but by and large, that is true.
All right. Thank you for that. And if no one else has any other comments on that topic, I'm going to close this out for this first hour by thanking you guys. That was a terrific discussion. And again, we barely scratched the surface, but covered a lot. For all three of you, if people want to reach out to you and find you, because this is such a great area, I think, for companies, because reimburses, I heard someone say this in the prep, I think it was Chris, but this is not something where people are competitive necessarily. People, on the sales teams, they're all fighting it out. But when it comes to reimbursement, it's the rising tide floats all boats. So if people want to reach out to you and just have a chat or ask you a question or two, where do they find you? Is LinkedIn the best way? Where do they track you down? Obviously, our cohort, for those of you who are here at MedTech Innovator, we'll share the contact information. But those of the people out there on LinkedIn or YouTube who are watching this, where do they find you? Starting with you, Tiffany.
Yeah, LinkedIn is the best. I mean, there's all those in-mail messages, and I definitely look at those and happy to help if I can.
Thank you, Tiffany. And Adi?
LinkedIn as well. Also, my website is just anrconsulting.net.
All right, thank you. And Chris?
Yeah, I'll go with the popular answer, LinkedIn, only because our email server is sometimes fishy or finicky from a security point of view. I may not be as attentive to LinkedIn as Adi and Tiffany are, but I promise I will respond.
All right. Terrific. Thank you guys for a great discussion. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you guys learned a little bit from each other. We're going to get into the